Welcome to the Monster Guys podcast, Halloween in July edition. We have some very special treats and perhaps some tricks in store for you tonight. Now please remove your heads and your arms. Oops, I mean your hats and your coats and your shawls, and leave them on the rack. Now please be so kind as to join us in the dead center of the ballroom. Pay no mind to her, she simply lost her head. Now watch your step around these little fellas. They're simply here to trip you up. You do have some goodies for our trick-or-treaters, don't you? You wouldn't want to upset them now, would you?
Michael, be careful. Watch your step here.
Where is this? Where are we?
Watch out. Oh my gosh, Michael, watch out. Look.
What do you see? What is it?
I spy with my little eye. It's Halloween in July.
Michael, it is July, and we are officially into our Halloween in July event on the Monster Guys podcast. I'm pretty excited about this.
I know. I am pretty excited too.
And there are a lot of other people excited about this who've been bugging us to get this on the air. So here we are, folks. Thank you for hanging out with us here on the Monster Guys podcast.
And as everybody should be, it's hot. It's really hot, so it's time to cool off.
Yeah, it is, definitely. Before we go any further, let me mention that this episode is sponsored by our book, Chaos Obsidiary, The Nightmare Has Begun. Michael, this is a book, 7 short dark fiction stories by yours truly and you. It's the first of 3 books in the trilogy, and if you would like a copy of that book, you can find it on all the major ebook retailers. You can also find it through our own web store if you'd like a signed copy of that book. And stay tuned, because later this month, those stories will be coming at you in audiobook form as well. So I'm very excited about that.
It'll be fun to see those come to life in audiobook. Horror stories, to me, have a lot to be gained when they are turned into something that you can listen to. There's a sort of emotion that you can hear in a really good narration that makes the story jump to life.
Yeah, definitely. This episode is also sponsored by the Monster Guys Patreon page. This is something new for us. Patreon, patreon.com/the Monster Guys. And it's just a place that we ask you to go put a little tip in the tip jar. Support what we're doing. As that grows, we're going to be able to produce more story experiences and more special events here on the Monster Guys podcast. So we would certainly appreciate you going and placing a tip in the tip jar, just a couple of bucks a month, or even a couple of sodas or a couple of coffees a month. If you're feeling generous, just throw that in there, and we certainly appreciate your support. Thank you to all of our new listeners. The past few months have grown exponentially for us. we're pumped about it. We've been doing this for a couple of years now, having a lot of fun, and a lot of new people are finding out about the Monster Guys podcast. So we thank you for joining us, hanging out with us, continuing the conversation with us over on Twitter, twitter.com/The Monster Guys. Very easy to find us and jump in that conversation with us. If you've been enjoying these episodes or enjoy this episode, if you wouldn't mind, go over to iTunes and rate and review the podcast. Give us some good news. Help other people find the podcast as well. It would mean a lot to us. It would certainly help other people find us and get us up there in the rankings a little bit. Halloween in July. Really, what this is about is just good fun. And it's an opportunity to cool off a little bit and get ready for the most wonderful time of the year, which is just a couple of months away. We're over halfway through 2017.
Yeah, we are.
Which means we're almost to the real Halloween. You know, a lot of people celebrate things like Christmas in July because they want to mentally cool off a little bit, and we think Halloween is even more fun to have in July.
Well, of course it is. Christmas is great and all. Christmas can be a lot of fun. There's always the family and traditions and tasty treats and such, but who doesn't love dressing up as monsters and getting the spook on?
It is, and you know what? When we do our live events in October, we always sing that Christmas song. It's the most wonderful time, and people join in with us right along because, in my opinion, it is the most wonderful time of the year. I love autumn. I love October. I love harvest time. I love everything about that time of year. So mentally, I refresh and I get excited and I feel like a little kid again when I think about that time of year.
And so far, everybody that I've heard you talk to about that has kind of said the exact same thing. Whenever you talk about Halloween being your favorite, or whenever I talk about Halloween being my favorite holiday, you know, people always say, well, yeah, it's mine too.
Yeah,
it's
of course.
It's the coolest one.
Yeah. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I can't remember where it was, but I was talking to somebody, and they mentioned that they weren't seeing as many kids out trick-or-treating every year, and they were putting out a call for people to get involved in Halloween, decorate their houses, and make it known that their neighborhoods are giving out candy and stuff. And I don't know, we go out trick-or-treating every year, and I see a lot of kids out, and I see a lot of teenagers out, and I see a lot of adults out.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think the whole trick-or-treating has certainly taken on a different feel in this day and age. Of course, there was the whole mess in the 80s and 90s with the candy scare and all those myths that were running around, and it kind of put a damper on things for a little bit, but not really. You know, kids are still out there having fun. I see people decorating their houses, get these big cauldrons in the driveway with all kinds of either punch or soup, or I remember one time as a kid, every year when you go by this certain house, there was a family who had a big cauldron in the driveway, and they would cook it. It was like cast iron. It was huge, and they would cook up soup. And in that part of the country where we lived, it was chilly outside, so they would cook up this soup, and they'd have these drinks, and trick-or-treaters would come by, and they'd have a lawn full of people just having soup or chili or whatever they were cooking up in the cauldron, and drinks, and, you know, had bobbing for apples and all kinds of little games for the kids in the front lawn. It was just a community affair, you know. And another neighborhood that we grew up in, there was a family that had a tennis court on their property. It was a strange thing to have a tennis court in the neighborhood, but they did. And every year they would turn this tennis court into this Halloween costume party, almost like a dance floor. So, you know, growing up, I loved Halloween, all the things that it stood for and it meant and you got to do during that time of year. And I still see people out celebrating all the time now. I do think people are going trick-or-treating earlier and not staying out as long is one thing that I've noticed. Because used to, man, we'd go out and we'd stay out for hours and we'd come back and throw the candy on the floor and look for the good stuff and get rid of the bad stuff. And really, I think that was just an excuse for moms and dad to take like a fourth of the candy to their room and have it to themselves. But it was always something that happened. So I don't know. I see people enjoying Halloween. I mean, heck, right now in July, you're going to start seeing Halloween decorations go up in stores. It, again, just like Christmas or Easter or anything else, these decorations, the retailers do it earlier and earlier every year. Last year, I think I said, just keep the Halloween decorations year round. You know, if you want to get early enough, just keep it up.
Just have a Halloween store stay up year round.
Yeah. So Halloween in July is just about good fun. It's about cooling off and refreshing and getting ready for one of our most favorite times of the year.
Well, I think you hit on something earlier, too, the community. Christmas, again, it's fun and all, and families get together and their Christmas office parties. I was about to say Halloween office parties, I wish. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there are social events. They're all kind of stiff sometimes, though, like the Christmas parties, especially.
Yeah.
But Halloween,
boring.
You get together with a group of friends, you go trick-or-treating, and you're going to strangers' houses, really, but you're seeing a different side of those people. On one hand, that in itself can be scary, and yet it's a time where you go and you're waiting awkwardly at the door, and then you see this stranger come out and they're smiling and have a bowl of candy, and it's something lighthearted and fun where you can cross random people's yards and connect on a deeper level than other holidays allow you to do.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a deeper level. I'm just like, give me the best candy, let's go.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, what other time of the year do you get to dress up as something completely off the cuff, completely bizarre, go to a stranger's house and receive food and candy from which you have no idea where it originated, and then you go home and consume that?
Or what about people who love to hide out on the porch as a scarecrow or as a mannequin or something?
Hey.
You can't pull it off at other times of the year.
I love that kind of stuff. I know two people who did that just a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That might have been
I'm
us.
looking at one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. You were a scarecrow. One of your famous costumes that you do is that of a scarecrow with a pumpkin head, full-on pumpkin on your head. And I was, I think, the Grim Reaper or something that year. And we were welcoming guests to this huge Halloween party, but they didn't know we were alive until they rolled up on us.
It was a lot of fun.
And usually I would try to make it known that I was alive to distract them from what you were doing, and then you'd come up behind them and boo. I'm not going to say what broke loose, but a whole lot broke loose.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. My favorite moment in that particular night was when one person came up and they couldn't decide if I was a statue or if I was somebody dressed up, so they actually poked me in the chest, declared out loud to their friends, "That's not real," turned around, and then I took a step forward and they ran.
Yeah.
So it's always fun to mess with people.
Surprise. Yeah, so a lot of fun in the next few weeks around here. Please share it around. Use the hashtag Halloween in July or the Monster Guys or the Monster Guys podcast or whatever. But share these episodes around. We would certainly appreciate it. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever you want to. We're also going to throw up some pictures, mainly through Twitter, of some different things. Like we've got some pictures of some of our guests in costume that are going up. You can send us your pictures as well at the Monster Guys on Twitter. Share those costumes or those party moments or your favorite Halloween moments with us, and we'd love to see you in Halloween action. Also, we're going to be doing a couple of big giveaways. We're going to reveal the contents of a couple of prize boxes that we have put together and actually are still putting together. There's still some things that are actually being put into these boxes, and we want you to put your name in the hat for those giveaways. 3 ways you can do that. Sign up for our newsletter. Go to themonsterguys.com. There's a tab to sign up for our newsletter. Leave a review on iTunes, and then let us know it was you, especially if your handle is different. But leave us a review on iTunes or put a tip in the tip jar at patreon.com/themonsterguys. Those 3 ways you can support us in a big way and also have your name put on the list to win one of these 2 giveaway prize boxes. Now, if you do all 3 of those things, then obviously your name goes in the hat for all 3 of those things. And one theme for one box is going to be more horror, scary oriented, and one box is going to be more folklore, mythology oriented. So just to give you a heads up on those, but your name can go on the list for one of those 2 boxes over the next few weeks. We'll give those away during the latter part of the month, but we'd love you to be a part of that in our Halloween in July event. I'd also like to give a big shout out to Chris Cavaretto from Werewolves in Siberia for the Monster Guys theme song. The song that you hear at the beginning of the episode, there's some sound effects and things that are kind of mixed in with it, but the song itself was written originally for the Monster Guys podcast by Werewolves in Siberia, and I just can't thank him enough for doing that for us. It was a huge surprise, and we were just overwhelmed with what he did for us with that song. We'll play it again at the end of the episode in full. You'll get to hear it. Check out his material, Werewolves in Siberia, on Bandcamp. He's got all of his stuff there. If you like horror synth or kind of a darker synth type sound, almost if you'd imagine John Carpenter movie soundtracks type thing, throwback retro type sounds.
Stranger Things.
He's got some amazing music. Check that out, and it is seriously appropriate music for Halloween in July. So go check that out. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that song. You'll hear it again at the end of the show. Today's topic, Michael, is Scarecrows. One of my favorite topics around Halloween. Scarecrows, created in our own image, is the official title of today's show. And we're going to get into that topic pretty heavy over the next few minutes. But before we do that, let me also say that Richard Martin, the Fear Merchant, is a guest on today's show. We'll be talking to him from Dublin, Ireland, on the show about Scarecrows. But before we get into the show too much, Michael, I'm going to ask you, put you on the spot. What is your favorite Halloween memory? Take us back in time and help us reminisce.
That's quite a lot to go through.
Yeah, well, we're not that old.
No, but it's a lot of Halloweens, and it's my, again, favorite holiday, so that's a lot to pick through. So I'd have to say, going back to that costume, the first time I donned that pumpkin-headed scarecrow costume, it was kind of a daunting task.
I have a picture of the first time you ever did that. I'll probably throw that up this week.
I was going to say that picture, I don't know if it has a certain little guy with it, but...
Yeah, it does.
Nathaniel, my little brother. So he and I dressed up that year and went to just a little competition. I wasn't sure how the scarecrow was going to work. You know, I covered all the skin. I had holey jeans and stuff, but we stuck hay into the holey jeans so it covered all traces of skin. I used a black invisible mask underneath the huge pumpkin head to make sure that nobody could see my face, so it was complete anonymity. But I really wasn't sure if the pumpkin was going to work because it's huge, it's heavy, it might fall off my head at any given point. But walking around that little competition and the little fair and the games and the booths that they had set up outside, that was actually really fun. I didn't necessarily go trying to make it scary. I carved the typical jack-o'-lantern face into the pumpkin head, so that could be a little creepy, I guess. But other than that, I was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans and gloves. So a lot of the smaller kids,
with a lot of hay coming out of
there was a lot
of
hay.
those places.
It was very itchy later on.
Yeah.
It was very hot and stuffy too, but stuffy, no pun intended. So walking around, a lot of the bigger kids were like, oh, that's cool. A lot of the adults were like, that looks heavy, but good job on that. And some of the smaller kids were terrified of me, which I hadn't intended, but it was kind of fun as well. It was funny though, because Nathaniel was perfectly fine. He didn't care. He knew who was under the mask, so he looked like this little kid that was next to the boogeyman and just didn't care. And he was dressed up as a kung fu master too. So
right.
I think my favorite memory was just being the monster next to him and watching him get to strut around with the boogeyman next to him and be perfectly fine.
Yeah, and he definitely loved it. And then when you guys went up on stage, and I think that year you won the costume contest and had some pretty decent prizes come out of that. I think even a set of tickets to Universal Studios.
Yeah.
Because we were living in Orlando, where we're originally from at the time. So it was good times all around. Nathaniel certainly loved walking around with his big brother, the boogeyman.
It was fun. Okay, so you threw the question at me, so let me turn it back on you and put you on the spot.
I think to be honest with you, I've got a lot of great memories of Halloween, and I think my favorite memory of Halloween would have to be just when you and Nathaniel trick-or-treating. My memory as a dad, as a father, is always my favorite memory. But there was a couple of years where you and Nathaniel and then our nephews, Christopher and Nicholas, all got together and did trick-or-treating, and it's when you guys were all a little bit younger. We jumped in the back of the truck, driving around neighborhoods and trick-or-treating, and then bringing all that home and dumping it in, the middle of the living room. The crazy thing about it is that it wasn't just the kids trick-or-treating, but it was all of us, adults and kids. So all those bags of candy. I mean, we're talking, 8 or 9, 20-something bags of candy that were dumped, and we were completely full because we went as many places as we possibly could, trick-or-treating. And I think it was just my favorite memory is us just laying down around the living room around that big old stack of candy and filtering through it, throwing it in stacks of favorites or good or bad or open, unopened, that kind of stuff, and just the fun that we had. And for me, as a dad, those are my favorite memories, and I'll always hold on to those the tightest. So, and then of course, the past few years, we go out trick-or-treating with the little ones along with the game group, your game group every year.
Which is pretty funny to
Which
see.
is hilarious because everyone in the game group dresses up. It's almost like they're all the big dressed up bodyguards for the little guys, and then we just hit a couple neighborhoods and have a lot of fun. So to me, it's just getting out there and just having some fun and having some family and community time and just relaxing, and that's my favorite. Okay, Michael, let's talk Scarecrows. One of my favorite points of interest for the Halloween season. I love Scarecrows. I love looking at them. For me, it's almost, they're like a symbol of the season. When I see a scarecrow, my mind automatically thinks harvest or the fields or the falling and the changing of leaves or that beautiful sunset that happens that time of year. It's just a very cool symbol of autumn for me, or the harvest time of year. So I know for a lot of people, scarecrows mean different things, and especially in our modern day, there's so much associated with them with horror movies. But we have talked about scarecrows before on the Monster Guys podcast, so let's review a little bit of what we have said and then broaden that in further discussion, and then we'll actually chime in with Richard Martin here in just a minute from Ireland and his take on scarecrows. But what do we bring to the table about scarecrows now?
I guess just as a recap of what we have talked about in the past, we had talked previously about how different cultures basically started coming up with the same ideas. Different time periods in different parts of the world kind of individually started doing the same thing. We had talked about how in Japan you have the kakashi, the collection of garbage that people would put up on poles and sticks to scare away pests, which to you and me, that was kind of funny because you would usually think of those stinky things, those smelly things as attracting pests, not driving them away.
Right. I think about the iconic example of the New York rat that people often use, but how rats would be attracted to garbage. Scavengers, so to speak. And yet the Japanese were creating scarecrows out of garbage and, if I'm not mistaken, old meats or thrown away food or stuffing these clothes with all this garbage, putting it up on a stick. But the smellier, the better was the idea.
Yeah, and that's where they get their name. Kakashi literally means smelly or stinky. So it's interesting, over time, they started humanizing that. They started putting clothes on the sticks and poles. They started putting hats on there. And a lot of the times they would give it a bow and an arrow, which was supposed to strike fear into those vermin, their hearts, I guess.
Right,
it makes me
as
wonder,
if those vermin know what a bow and arrow is.
Well, that's the thing, is it makes me wonder, did enough people go out shooting, birds or rats or whatever would plague the fields? It makes me wonder if that was something that happened commonly enough that things would be driven off just by the sight of it. But
or was
a
it just
practice.
an image, Europeans may put a sword in their hand.
Right. So it's interesting. You spoke of Europeans. For a long time during the medieval times, you have kids running up and down the rows of different crops with wooden blocks that they would clap
just
together.
what would Americans put in? A gun? A rifle?
We'll actually get to that later.
Okay.
So they would have kids that would go up and down, slapping these blocks together to make these loud clanging noises, and obviously that was more effective than,
Yeah, and that was a long time ago, like in the Dark Ages.
Mm-hmm.
Kids would walk up and
Before
down
the
the
plague.
rows of fields, clopping their wood blocks together to scare away animals or birds. And yeah, that would be a lot more effective than just a static creature on a stick.
Well, that's part of the thing with the Scarecrow, is it never has seemed to be super effective. Like, when you think of scarecrows, a lot of artists will portray them, and a lot of photographers have gotten this picture where the birds hang out on the Scarecrow's arms. It seems kind of ironic.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll get into that more later, like I said. Going back a bit in time, we have the Greek and Roman people who would actually use less of a scarecrow image and more of a wooden statue of the god Priapus, who would stand out in the rows, and he was supposed to do the same thing, scare them off. So you have different cultures that kind of evoke the same images, or at least come to the same conclusions, that a human figure should scare away pests. We also talked a little bit in the past about human sacrifice. How a lot of scholars believe that people would be sacrificed, oftentimes voluntarily, for the good of the land, for the good of the harvest.
Right.
And they would be put up on poles, and that this is where we get the earliest imagery of the scarecrow. And I would like to touch on that a little bit more as we talk tonight.
Yeah, because we have quite a bit of that in story form, in literature. Of course, we see that in modern art forms, movies, film, that kind of thing. And there is an understanding that that's where a lot of our images of scarecrow comes from. Old religions or cults or belief systems that believe that in order to appease the gods, if you will, we have that idea, almost like we're appeasing the gods or ensuring fertility or good crops, good growth, that a human sacrifice would provide that. And of course, that theme runs through a lot of religions throughout history, but it stems a lot in our current imagery of the scarecrow from that belief and from that system of thinking. But we will expound upon that a little bit more later, but we have touched on that in the past.
Yeah, and about your question about what Americans would put in there.
Right.
They did actually use a musket.
Got my rifle. Dadgummit, American, I got my rifle. My scarecrow's got a rifle too. Dad blame varmints ain't gonna get my...
So this is from the Household Cyclopedia of 1881.
1881, ladies and gentlemen.
According to this, the most effectual method of banishing them, meaning the crows, from a field, as far as experience goes, is to combine one or another of the scarecrows in vogue the frequent use of the musket. Nothing strikes such terror into those sagacious animals as the sight of a fowling piece and the explosion of gunpowder, which they have known so often to be fatal to their race. So yes, they did put the gun in the hand.
So the assumption is that the crows remember what the musket is.
Well, during that time, actually, in the 1800s, along the Atlantic coast, they actually started offering bounties for the bodies of dead crows because it had become such a problem. So people were killing crows so much to turn them in for the bounties that they actually started to experience the opposite effect, where the cornworms and other bug pests would come in because the crows weren't eating them off.
Right.
So the bugs started to do more damage than the original pests and vermin did. So they had to back off of it. But it is funny because people often take the role of scarecrow. A lot of Native Americans would actually stand at the edge of their field and they would actually start to howl or bark to get birds to go away.
Right.
So just like those medieval kids who run around with wooden blocks, you have other cultures and, in an early American history of people standing guard in the field as well.
So you've got the Japanese who would create the Kakashi, or the scarecrow really fashioned from garbage, from trash. Mm-hmm. You've got kids in Europe that were clopping through the fields with wooden blocks or whatever to scare away. And really, if you jump a little forward in history with that, the plague was wiping out the population, so the kids were no longer readily available for that. So then they go to the scarecrow over there. In my imagination, something from like Monty Python is you have this weird scarecrow with a sword in the middle of the field that, the knights who say knee or something to scare away the crows.
They didn't use guns, they just shouted knee.
They just shouted knee. They didn't need a gun. And, in America, of course, dadgummit, we got muskets. So we put the scarecrows out there with the musket because according to 1880 something or another encyclopedia, crows know what a musket is, and they're terribly afraid of it.
Because it has been so fatal to their race.
It has been so fatal to their race. And, of course, Native Americans with methods of standing on the edges of the field and howling and, creating noise and sound, which to me is much more effective. It goes back to the kids clopping through the fields. The noise and the movement is really what's going to scare away something.
Well, speaking of movement, some tribes were actually super clever about this. There was one tribe in what is now New York that would actually dip corn seed into a mixture of herbs and such that they would actually let the crows eat.
Oh, yeah, almost like a poison.
Yeah, and now I kind of want to reference this and say that ninja were known as being chemists. They would actually use poisons to make sure that fowl, like waterfowl and frogs, would not stop making their nighttime noises when they approached.
Right.
This reminds me of that. So they would make these herbal mixtures and they would dip the corn seed in them and let the crows eat these. So what the crows were forced to do at that point, the poison caused them to flap around crazily around the cornfield, and it actually scared off other crows. So it is the more literal scarecrow.
A lot of the noise and the movement of crazed birds would scare off the other birds.
Which was very smart and very clever.
Yeah. So we'll get more into some cultural references and global references of scarecrows in just a few minutes, but we want to take a pause now and invite Richard Martin, the fear merchant, from Dublin, Ireland, onto the show and chat with us for a few minutes about scarecrows from his perspective. Richard is steeped in horror mythology and horror movies and everything else, and he's got some interesting things to say. So let's switch over and talk to Richard for just a few minutes. We're here with Richard Martin, the fear merchant. Once more, welcome back to the Monster Guys podcast. It's great to have you. How you doing, man?
Hello, guys. Thanks for having me back. It's been a long time, as far as I can recall. Things are moving so fast these days.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a while. Tell us what you're up to. If anybody wants to contact you, they can find you at The Fear Merchant, Twitter, Facebook, pretty much anywhere. Is that right?
Yeah, I think if you look at The Fear Merchant, it's pretty much everywhere. TheFearMerchant.com is basically just a link aggregate, so you can find everything on there if you want to know more about me. But I suppose I'll get the shameless plug in early. I'm also now hosting the Bizarre Cast, which you have been guests on, and that was great fun. Just an interview show with all the cool people I like to talk to in the sphere of sci-fi, horror, and the bizarre.
Yeah, it's definitely a very cool show, and we're excited when you put out new stuff, and I definitely encourage people to go check that out. So check out The Fear Merchant and his show, The Bizarre Cast. But today we are beginning our Halloween in July campaign, if you will. And just trying to have a little bit of fun in the hot months over here in the U.S. You're over there in Ireland. Is it really hot over there in the summertime? Is it pretty mild?
Well, it's fairly mild, but this week now it was like an Alabama swamp. The old, I don't know, is this a family show? It was a bit sweaty.
Yeah.
It was okay. I was told in work I had to change out of my shorts even though it was so warm. So it was very, very warm. It was about 27 degrees, I think.
Celsius, so
that's about 80 degrees.
And is that and you consider that warm?
Yeah, that was mind-bogglingly warm because the week before that I was over in Malta on business and that was about 28, 29, 30, 32, which is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. And I was melting, couldn't sleep, getting up in the middle of the night, just the heat. I can't handle the heat. I'm a big guy. I'm 6'3", 18 stone, a big guy. So the heat doesn't do me well.
Yeah, me either. I don't know how many stones I am because pounds to stones. I don't know. It's Celsius to Fahrenheit, inches to centimeters. I don't know. We're all over the metrics here, but it's definitely hot, and we want to peel back that heat a little bit. I don't care what part of the year you're in. It's always a good time to talk about Halloween. So we're talking Halloween. Our topic today, Michael and Richard, is scarecrows, something that is regularly associated with that time of year, whether it's Halloween or harvest time, the fall, autumn, as most people like to say, and it's a fascinating topic. Globally, there are so many different stories and implications to the topic of scarecrows. But Richard, first thing I want to ask you is if you can recall in your life, when's the first time you ever saw a scarecrow? Was it terrifying or was it cool? What do you remember about being introduced to scarecrows?
Well, I suppose the first scarecrow I probably saw was the fictional scarecrow of the Scarecrow of Oz.
Oh, okay.
The Wizard of Oz. But I've seen probably a few scarecrows out in maybe my granduncle's field, we'll say, on his farm. And they look a bit creepy if you're not really wondering what they are. And you kind of ask your mum or your dad, what's that about? Why is there a man out in the field? And they say, oh no, that's to scare the crows away. And you're kind of asking yourself, well, I don't really see any crows, so it must be doing its dues. Or you kind of wonder, how does it work? There's a bit of a magical essence to a scarecrow, I find.
Yeah, definitely. You brought up The Wizard of Oz, and to be honest with you, I should be ashamed of this, but I didn't even think about The Wizard of Oz when thinking about scarecrows. I think about that movie and that particular scarecrow, and I think fun and musical and something like that. I don't think Halloween when I think about that movie. But, I know a lot of people who are afraid, just like they are of clowns, of even the friendly scarecrow. So it definitely has its place. And there's the scarecrow is used a lot. You mentioned out in your uncle's field for farming, but there's also the fictional character.
The Wizard of Oz scarecrow is a really cool scarecrow because something about scarecrows is that they're made in our image. And a lot of the fiction that we write about scarecrows, or a lot of the movies that we film about or have scarecrows in them, that character usually ends up trying to be human or wanting to be human. The funny thing about the Wizard of Oz scarecrow is that he's always wanting to have brains. He talks about, I don't mind if somebody hits me or pinches me or sticks me with a needle because I can't feel it. I'm made of straw. But I'm afraid of somebody calling me a fool because I don't have brains like you do. You see throughout the story, before he ever gets to the wizard, he's actually one of the smarter people in the group. He's already got the brains. He's just afraid of not being considered human. And so that's an interesting thing that you come across in scarecrow folklore and scarecrow fiction pretty often. It is interesting. You said you actually have, or your great uncle has scarecrows on his farm, though. A lot of the scarecrows are dying out in the world today because I like how you put it earlier, you don't really see any crows around, so it must be magic. Scarecrows themselves have been found not to be too effective anymore, and it's questioned whether they were ever terribly effective to begin with. So a lot of companies have moved on to using mechanized machines that will move whenever a bird gets close, or even things like the wacky inflatable men that you usually see going down the road waving their arms wildly.
By a car garage sale or something like that.
Yeah, or the random storefronts.
Yeah.
So do you still see scarecrows in Ireland today? Are those still around a lot?
Now, I've been criticised by my lovely girlfriend that I grew up in the city and she's of farming stock herself, so she's given me a few pointers for today. So shout out to Maeve for a bit of backstory.
Oh, very good.
On a few of the topics. No, I've seen scarecrows when I've been around the place. Maybe not in the last 10 years, because I suppose I haven't actually been out to much farms. But I'd nearly say myself it's more of a deterrent, not of scarecrows, but scare men or something. Because if you're walking through a field and you're not supposed to be there and you see some sort of figure standing up, you're like, oh shit, what are... Excuse my French. Oh no. And you're kind of ducking and diving, but then you find out that it's just a straw stuffed jacket or something. So
yeah,
you would see them around the place. I don't know why they would scare away birds, because we always see the depiction, and I'm implanting a memory in myself, but I think I've seen birds actually resting on a scarecrow.
Yeah, it's much more of a resting place than it is a deterrent.
So, I don't know, maybe in the past where there was more people out in the fields as opposed to big machinery, maybe birds were less inclined to fly down to something that looked like a man. As you alluded to, there's lots of machinery now on a farm, so birds might necessarily know what a human would look like, so maybe they're less deterred by scarecrows.
Yeah, or you may have that situation, what is it, that show Supernatural? I think early on did an episode about, I think it was titled Scarecrow, but it was actually about a Norse god that was brought over to the States way back when, and it ended up being a scarecrow that would jump down off of his perch and go devour the human sacrifices that were being fed to him each year. So I don't know, the whole scare. Michael, though, let's go back. You talked about the scarecrow in Wizard of Oz always wanting brains, couldn't feel anything. We're going to get real deep here. So what you're telling me is that the scarecrow in the Wizard of Oz is really a zombie?
Yeah, I wouldn't call him a zombie. He wanted brains for himself to think by, but I don't think he was going to eat the brains per se.
How do you know? Maybe that's just what he was telling people.
That's a good question.
was a big ruse.
It was a big ruse, and he's actually out for brains to consume.
I bet he was going to like eat Dorothy's brains or something, and that's when the what is he? The Tin Man comes into the picture.
Well, now we're getting into Richard's area of expertise. Somebody's going to do a movie, The Demented Wizard of Oz, where the Scarecrow is actually a zombie and eats Dorothy's brains, and everything goes chaos in that movie now. Is that out there yet, Richard? Has anybody done that? Do we need to do that?
I suppose we'll have to do it now. We'll have to write an old script. I know you guys are very apt at the old script, not script writing, but writing in general. I'm sure you'll be able to come up with something that will be half decent at least.
We can try. But no, it's an interesting point because, like I was saying earlier, scarecrows they want to be human. So I think that's part of why, as you call it, less of a scarecrow and more of a scare man. I think that's part of the reason we have issues with them is because we make them in our image, and some of them are pretty spot on. So in the dark from far away, you kind of get that Uncanny Valley theme going where it looks just real enough that maybe that thing could get down and walk toward me, and what would I do then? So it definitely does seem more. I don't know why we started putting people on sticks to scare birds. We scare ourselves more easily.
Well, let me touch on something you just said there, because this is gonna have relevance to most of our episodes throughout the month of July. You said the Uncanny Valley. For people who may not know what that is, for listeners who may not be familiar with that term, define that so we understand the context of what you're talking about there.
The Uncanny Valley is when something gets closer and closer to trying to be the likeness of a human being. It doesn't quite get there. A big example in media is the Polar Express. If you watch that, there's something not quite right with the models and it looks a bit off. So when you see something
very much not right about that movie.
Yeah, so when you see something that's maybe nearly human, you see it a lot with those robots, romantic robots, you could say. Where there's an uncanny valley with those. They don't look quite human and there's something quite off. There's actually a good podcast episode. I don't know if you listen to the Stuff You Should Know network or How Stuff Works network.
Yeah.
They did a tech stuff episode on the Uncanny Valley. So guys, you should check that out if you want to learn more on the Uncanny Valley.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think dolls, like baby dolls, is a great example of that.
Dolls and clowns. Clowns is one of the biggest examples of why people get freaked out.
Do you know when they do like a baby or something in a game or a toddler, but it's actually proportioned just like they shrunk down the model for a human?
Yeah.
Or not a human, sorry, but an adult. And it just looks bizarre seeing a child shrunk to the proportions of an adult, which is not right because, children have proportionately, I suppose, bigger heads and stuff because they're kind of growing into themselves. That's like an Uncanny Valley sometimes you see it, which is very, very freaky.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is we should stuff a baby doll with hay, perch it up on a stick, and paint its face with clown makeup, and we'd have the ultimate example of the Uncanny Valley.
I think that might be like nuclear holocaust. There'd be no one within miles of that abomination.
At that point, you just give the land over to the crows. They roll it at that point.
I am going to go find a baby doll that I can create like that for Richard and figure out how I can afford to send it over the ocean, but I need you to have that, Richard.
Be going straight in the bin or like burnt at the stake. I'm sorry to say in advance, I appreciate the gift.
Well, for all that they are or they're not, scarecrows have their place in cultures around the world and in our stories. They definitely have staying power. Richard, can you, outside of The Wizard of Oz, can you tell us what is your favorite scarecrow? Book, legend, movie? You're a movie expert, so maybe you've got something there.
Expert, I wouldn't know about that. I at least give the illusion that I am. But the scarecrow that sort of jumps out the most for me, I'd say, would be the Scarecrows, plural, in the video game for the Nintendo 64. Can you guess what I'm going to say? The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, where there was a scarecrow who taught you a song, or he was a human or something. There was some side quest I never finished, so it's forever an elusive mystery. But it just really stood out to me because he would move side to side, very like jaunty. And I don't know, it's something I've always thought about when I heard of scarecrows and when we were going to be discussing this. So that was one Scarecrow, because I played that a lot when I was a kid. The other sort of Scarecrow monster would be the movie franchise even. Jeepers Creepers 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Where some sort of demon that masqueraded as a Scarecrow. And then, of course, in the DC Comics universe, the Scarecrow who has a sort of a fear toxin. So he plays on fear, which I suppose is very fitting since it is supposed to be a Scarecrow, but he's being a scare Batman or scare man, as we've alluded to earlier. So that would kind of be my 3 examples. I don't want to go on forever, but those are definitely the most prominent Scarecrows.
Well, Richard, thanks for talking to us about Scarecrows this week. We're going to chat with you again next week about another topic in our Halloween in July campaign, but stay cool over there. Don't go to Malta during the summer. We don't need you melting and having to change out of your shorts and all that kind of weird stuff.
No, if I was left up on a pike like a Scarecrow now, I'd be roast to a crisp. I'd go up in flames. That straw would not last very long. But thanks very much for having me on again, guys. It was a pleasure.
All right. We'll see you soon. Michael, let's go finish our conversation about Scarecrows this week. Always good to chat with Richard. Love talking to him and absolutely love the accent. I can never get enough of the accent. Secret about DC is I love foreign accents. Let's go back to the conversation surrounding human sacrifice, because that is kind of an origin story for a lot of people where scarecrows are concerned. The harvest time, the blessing of the gods or the appeasement of the gods, the fertilization of the soil, the blessing of the soil through blood or other means like that. But the sacrifice is something that stands out historically about the Scarecrow. I guess you had some more information to expound on that topic with regards to Scarecrow. What did you find? What are you thinking?
In the past, we had talked about how scholars believed that scarecrows, or the imagery of scarecrows, or the idea for some cultures comes from human sacrifice, of this idea of putting somebody up on a pole and sacrificing them for the good of the harvest, to bless the land, like you said. Reading into it a bit more since then, doing more research, this is a common theme in Gothic literature of old. This is a common theme in our modern-day pop culture. I mean, you can see it in everything from the Supernatural TV show to more recent movies like Sinister 2, I believe, ends in this scene of somebody trying to sacrifice a family of people to a demonic entity to bring about good stuff for them, basically. It's something that is widely purported. Reading into it a bit more, there is a folklorist, Juliet Wood, who has a lot of good thoughts on scarecrows in general, but she actually brings up the fact that there's not a lot of solid evidence for actual human sacrifice stemming into scarecrows. There are a lot of references to the bonfires of scarecrows. I mean, bonfires of the season, really, but the fact that they did end up on the bonfire at the end of the season just because, they had to get rid of them at some point. She goes on to talk about how films like The Wicker Man have kind of helped purvey this idea further and how that's influenced a lot of our culture today. Things like the Burning Man Festival. You have other bonfire rituals that happen politically today, where you might have in Europe some parades that, like the Guy Fawkes parades that show certain figures being lit on fire, either to celebrate or to denounce, depending on the flavor of that parade, if you will. But she brings up a good point, that there's not a whole lot of evidence that actually shows that it stemmed from actual human sacrifice. That is not to say that human sacrifice was not a thing. We see that a lot in Nordic cultures as a voluntary thing. We do see that a lot in even Japanese cultures. They would have voluntary people come up and actually be built into structures to make sure that the structure stayed sound. They believe that those spirits would stay in the walls and help it, last throughout the years, which is pretty creepy.
Yeah.
Especially for the people who go in later and find out that there are bodies within these walls.
Yeah, so basically what she's saying is that there's not a lot of physical evidence that the scarecrow, the figure, the construct, stems from actual human sacrifice, but it was more from the stories surrounding that figure.
Yeah, it's a interpretation of folklore and of things that we've studied and found within other cultures. Scarecrows
that makes me feel better. I'm going to take my volunteer list down for this year's harvest.
Oh, dear.
don't have to engage in that activity anymore. That's awesome.
I don't even want to know. Well, I mean, again, she does go on to to reinforce the knowledge that, yes, there were effigies of humans, essentially scarecrows, that were used in place sometimes, or they seemed to be used in place sometimes. But that's the issue that she takes with it, is that it is a seeming implication and not solid evidence. And sometimes it may just be the happen chance that they're burning, stuff for the fall season, and they have to get rid of the scarecrow, so pile it up on top. And there is something that we find in that, and something that we imply meaning to.
Yeah, so we don't know, reaching back into history, we don't know for sure one way or the other 100% all the time. So we have to take some of that with a grain of salt and realize that as humans, especially as humans, we place a lot into symbols.
And meaning, yeah.
And meaning. So a lot of that could have been symbolic and, carried through oral tradition or literature or whatever as factual, as actual events, but in reality, it was more symbolic.
Well, our friend Matthew Meyer often says that folklore belongs to the people and it's a never-changing thing. So yeah. I think that fits in there. And she makes a point to say, we don't know for sure. So I'm not, her statement is that she's not saying that it wasn't truth either, but just that we shouldn't say that it was absolute truth. And she goes on to say that in our modern culture, for sure, it is just as powerful as a symbol as it always has been. We'll always see those scarecrow sacrifices in some horror movies or even in our literature and our TV shows.
Funny story, Michael. When we moved out here to the Midwest from Orlando, one of the first years we were out here, I remember looking across our property to another field. I don't know if you remember this. It was a creepy thing that year. It hasn't happened since, but I look across the field, and this was during the harvest season. This was right after we moved here, not too long after we moved here. And whoever owned that field had started putting up these big hay constructs, these big hay.
Oh yeah, I did forget about that.
I don't even know what to call them, but it almost, to be honest with you, almost looked like something out of the Blair Witch Project, made out of big hay bundles that were standing all through that field. And I just remember day after day looking across that field and wondering who's going to die.
Yeah, almost like something you'd see at
or
the
when's
stake.
the fire going to start, And I wondered, in the witching hour, do I go out and find, a group of people in a circle or something? It was just the strangest thing that year to see all these big things made out of hay sitting in that field and not knowing what was coming next and wondering, why were we moving out here again?
So you put meaning to those.
Yeah, but I've never seen them since. I still to this day, I could find out pretty easily who owns that particular field, but I've never looked it up, and it's just always been a big open field. To this day, I don't know what they meant. I mean, they obviously didn't scare too many people or too much off, but why did we have these big hay constructs, in the field across from us? I don't know.
Maybe they were hay dollies, kind of like the corn dollies, which were said to bring in the spirits of the corn to ensure that more corn was made.
I guess, but there's no corn over there. There never was any corn.
No, but I'm saying like a hay dolly instead of a corn dolly.
So we want to bring in more hay?
I guess so.
We don't need more hay around here. I mean, that's all there is around here is hay. So that being said, what are some other, let's reach around the globe a little bit. We talked about the Japanese, we talked about the Roman, we talked a little bit about some European and even some American and Native American symbols and activities surrounding the scarecrow, or I would say the spirit of the scarecrow. Where do we go from here? There's some others, German and other forms of the scarecrow that we're familiar with.
Let's actually go to the German settlers in America.
Let's go to the German settlers in America, Michael.
That's a fun... let's do that.
I think that's a good starting place.
During the 1800s, German farmers in Pennsylvania would actually put up the Bootsmann, and sometimes his wife, the Bootsfrau. I believe I'm saying that right.
The Bootsmann and Bootsfrau.
And
I'll have to ask my aunt.
They have another name, which you might find familiar.
Yes.
The Boogeyman.
The Boogeyman.
And the Boogie Wife.
It seems there's a lot of scarecrow activity that was taking place in the 1800s.
Yeah, actually. Well, I mean, that's when a lot... So that's an
Maybe
interesting
I should have
point.
lived in the 1800s.
It's an interesting point. That's where a lot of our history comes from.
Nah, I don't want to live in the 1800s.
Probably not. It's like that meme where you see somebody was like, I should have been born at another time, and then you see this comic strip of them born into another time, and they said, oh, well, my kids are all dying of plague, and also I can't vote,
probably
or something
not
like
happen.
that. But yeah, you actually do have a lot of stuff happening at that time, because that's when a lot of people are settling in the Americas. And I still think of Halloween as a primarily American holiday. We get our origins from other cultures.
I mean,
a lot of Gaelic cultures.
Right. It comes from, the celebration of Samhain, and then of course you have Hallowmass and All Hallows Eve and other religious influences there, but primarily Halloween as we celebrate it today, is an American celebration.
Yeah, so we get a lot of that imagery from back at that time, and all of those cultures were converging. The Irish were bringing over their bogies and their carved turnips, which became pumpkin heads.
And we'll talk more about them later this month, too.
Yes. So they were bringing over their bootsaman, or their bogeymen,
or Bootsafrau.
Which explains why the boogeyman...
Don't forget the boogeyman's wife.
I won't.
Michael.
But it explains why the boogeyman is so tied to the image of a scarecrow. We talked about that in the past, about how the Nightmare Before Christmas, the Oogie Boogie character is that burlap sack insect.
The Oogie Boogie Man.
So it still sticks with us today, which is pretty cool. But yeah, you've got other places that do a lot of cool stuff. Still in the Americas, you have other tribes that would put up poles, and then they would put strings up between those poles, and from those strings they would hang shoulder bones and pieces of skin from coyotes and wolves and dogs, and on top of the poles they would put different types of skulls. So it's pretty spooky and could be pretty grisly, I guess, at times, and scare off other creatures.
And I think some of that goes, if you look at gardening, just simple gardening, you can put certain hairs of animals, or the blood of animals, or different meal or food items around your garden, and it will deter pests.
That's true. I didn't even think about that.
And I mean, today you can go to the store and just buy this big bag of something how silly. Who wants to go to a store and buy something? But anyway, that reminds me of the fur of the animal or blood. There, these gardening traditions, or if you read gardening books from long ago, it will tell you to do these certain things. That seems to be a more extreme case or practice of those gardening tips, if you will.
Well, it makes sense, too.
From the 1800s.
If you're hanging up bones, and especially like shoulder bones and such, I can imagine those clanging together a bit in the wind and making noise, scaring off birds and such.
You say bones surround... There's a place not too far from here that I used to pass a couple times a month while driving. It was actually about probably 5-7 miles away from here, but it's out in fields, and it's this person's property that's surrounded by a barbed wire fence that's old and rusted and all bent up with these wooden posts, and everywhere along the fence and on posts in the yard around the house, there are skulls that are placed everywhere of all kinds of different animals and what looks to be like pelts that have deteriorated, that are still hanging there, and just all kinds of weird little things that you might find out in the field. This person has brought and put on their barbed wire fence and on poles in the front of the yard, and it's right across the street from a very modern county facility.
Well, maybe that's why.
And it was, I always thought who are they trying to scare away? Who are they trying to keep out of their property? And how long until that county or that government agency forces them to take it down or quote unquote clean up their property? But I could just sense, just driving by, that they were certainly intending to keep something or somebody out. And it wasn't just like a few feet. We're talking about probably a good mile worth of fence and bone and posts with skulls on them, animal skulls. It's strange.
It is very strange.
It was like a whole Scarecrow property. But I noticed, just in the past few months that those skulls have been disappearing. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like the property is being reclaimed or it's being cleaned up or something. I don't know what happened, but always struck me as odd. Why did we move out here again? Because between the hay bales and those, I don't know, it's kind of weird.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the skulls on poles, because in Italy, they would actually put skulls on poles.
Yeah.
In the Middle Ages, they would
Well, I think
actually...
there's a band called Skulls on Poles.
I'm sure there is. And then you have skulls
I don't
on
know, that's
the
weird.
fence
That's
for
odd.
Baba Yaga. I mean,
That's
she
true.
would kind of do the
That's
same
true.
thing, I guess.
It's a punk band, I think, from Italy, Skulls on Poles.
They're not scarecrows, but scare humans.
Scare humans.
Boogeyman. We came full circle. No, so in Italy, they also had these... They basically did the same thing. They would hang a bunch of stuff up on a pole, but they would have a skull on top. And the belief was that it would have magical powers and would protect the crops and such from vermin, but it would also keep away diseases. It's kind of funny because you put the remnant of a dead thing on top of a pole. It's not what most people would think in modern times, keeping away disease, but that's what they believed. Away from Pennsylvania, but back in Germany.
Hey, like repels like.
In actual Germany, not in Pennsylvania, Germany, you had German farmers that would also put up their scarecrows, which were actually wooden witches. And the belief, I find this one interesting. So the belief was that these effigies, if you will, would actually draw in the evil spirit of winter so that the season could continue on.
Change, yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of a different take of season. You know, we always think of scarecrows being in the fall, but that was actually to drive away, well, not even drive away, but draw in the evil spirit that they personified as winter.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all of these really cool, different supernatural things going on, and then you have some cool chemical things going on with Native American tribes driving birds crazy to scare off other birds. Those are some of the origins of scarecrows across the world.
Yeah, and all very fascinating. And it's not just about the physical scarecrow, but it's also about the spirit of the scarecrow, so to speak. What I find interesting about this conversation, I think possibly even more interesting on a deeper level than just the figure of the scarecrow, is the idea behind it, the spirit behind it. And that is there are some cultures that believe that they were creating gods in their own image, or they were creating these constructs in their own image. And going along that line of thinking, we can pull all kinds of example from history and even modern day, from gargoyles to Frankenstein's monster, into the scarecrow conversation.
Well, yeah. So we actually had a really fun conversation on Twitter recently, where somebody had posed the question of...
Twitter.com/The Monster Guys.
What was the question, actually? It was something along the lines of, would you consider homunculi to be simulacrum, like scarecrows, or would you consider them to be more automatons? And it was a fun conversation. It was a fun little thought experiment, and the people involved were throwing out ideas from Frankenstein's monsters to different homunculi to different robots and such. Eventually, they came up with the idea that, you know, it was going to be more of the simulacrum or the effigy, the human figure, because automaton speaks more of something self-motivated, typically machine work. It's an interesting thought, though. You had talked about gods, about scarecrows being gods, and I don't think most people think of them that way. But in Japan, you have the Kojiki, which is one of the oldest documents in Japan. It's one of the primary texts for the Shinto religion, and it speaks of Kubiko, who is the crumbling prince or the disabled prince. This guy's really cool. His longer title is something like one who has spent too much time in the rice paddy field on the mountain, or something very Japanese. But he's this scarecrow. He is literally a scarecrow who cannot walk anywhere, but he's falling apart. And people come to him because he knows everything.
But he's a god.
Very wide. He's very wise. He's a deity of knowledge. So he can't really go anywhere, but he knows everything. He's kind of like one of those oracles in Greek or Roman mythology that people go on these quests to find.
Which is an interesting reversal of the whole Wizard of Oz scarecrow. Here the Wizard of Oz scarecrow is seeking for brains, but in this Japanese deity, he is that ultimate knowledge.
I actually wanted to talk about the Wizard of Oz Scarecrow in regards to him, because Kubiki is stuck, and he's all-knowing and wise. Both in the film and in the original Land of Oz books, the Scarecrow, you know, he's originally stuck, and Dorothy has to help him get down. At first, he can't move, just like the god. But he is seeking brains because he's afraid of, and we talked about this a little bit with Richard, he's afraid of not being smart enough. He's afraid that people are going to think he's a fool because he
Right.
doesn't have a physical brain. And yet he turns out to be the smartest of the bunch. He's also the most naive of the bunch. And you and I were talking about this previously off the mic. There are a lot of scarecrows that come to life or are brought to life in some manner or fashion. You talked about Frankenstein's monster. Even he, I think, would fit in this in some manner. They're all of these effigies or these simulacrums that come to life, but they're not necessarily adults. They haven't really lived a full life. So they are smart, but they're also very childlike.
Mm-hmm.
So they're also very naive. Even Skellington Jack from The Nightmare Before Christmas kind of falls into the same realm. He's a very scarecrow-like figure. I think he's one of your favorite characters of
absolutely.
all time. He shows up as a scarecrow at first in disguise, but he has been around for a very long time. He stumbles into a world that is very different from his own, and he suddenly becomes literally like a kid running around the snow and asking, what is this?
But remember, right, when he goes to Christmas, but remember, he is like a god of his own realm.
He is. He's not Oogie Boogie, but he's a boogeyman in his own right. He talks about how people in different cultures know him as different trickster gods, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always interesting because these scarecrows seem to take on the role of somebody that's a trickster god, and yet at the same time, this little kid who is vulnerable to the world.
Right. And there's even a story about a witch. I forget where it's from. Tell us that story.
It's the story of Feathertop.
Yeah,
It's
Feathertop,
actually
okay.
an early American tale to 19-something.
Not the 1800s?
No, for once, not the 1800s.
Where
It's
does it take
1852. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Feathertop story in 1852.
Yeah, so recap that story because that's an interesting line of thought in this same conversation, the spirit of the scarecrow or that childlike, godlike figure.
I'm glad you asked because there's actually a pretty awesome quote that I want to use from that. But to give some background, the story of Feathertop, basically it's about a witch who brings to life this collection of junk, a scarecrow, and she enchants him so that he seems human. And the way she does this is she gives him a magical pipe that as long as he's using it, holding it, puffing it, he appears human.
That sounds like Frosty the Snowman with a hat.
Actually, that does. I didn't think about that.
And Frosty has a pipe too.
Is he just a snow scarecrow?
He's a snow crow.
A snow cone?
Okay, let's go back to the story.
No, I just want a snow cone. So Feathertop was this enchanted scarecrow who he actually believed himself to be human as well. As long as this enchantment was working, he himself truly thought of himself as a human being. So she sends him basically on a revenge quest. He doesn't know this, but she sends him to town. He gets involved with a certain judge's daughter. Now, different stories have elaborated on why she was trying to pester this judge or get revenge on this judge, but the original story doesn't go into much detail. Basically, what happens is Feathertop falls in love with his daughter. The daughter falls in love with Feathertop until the day that they both look in the mirror together and they both see Feathertop for what he is, just this scarecrow. So the daughter of the judge runs away in obvious horror and feeling sad that, she's been duped this entire time. And Feathertop himself is coming to terms with, obviously, an existential crisis at that moment.
Right.
He goes back to the witch.
He needs to take a road trip.
Yeah. He goes back to the witch, and he purposefully, in front of her, throws down the pipe because he can't accept the fact that he's not human. And the witch's statement is pretty powerful. She says, there are thousands upon thousands of coxcombs and charlatans in the world, made up of just such a jumble of worn-out, forgotten, and good-for-nothing trash as he was. Yet they live in fair repute, and they never see themselves what they are. He's referred to as a wretched simulacrum at that point. Mm-hmm. And her whole point is that he is probably more pure of heart and better than any human that she's referring to. All of these different judges and frauds throughout the world that actually are human, they don't stand near as close as he does to good people.
And I think this begs the conversation. We talked a little bit about this earlier that, for a lot of religions and a lot of belief systems, a lot of cultures, humans are created in the image of God or of their God. And I kind of wanted to flip the table, so to speak, because just like the witch creating this creature or these other creations that we've talked about, it's almost as if with scarecrows, and particularly the spirit of the scarecrow, as humans, we're trying to create our own image, or possibly create the image of our desire of a god or for a god into this scarecrow. You see, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it makes sense.
It seems like we're trying to re-engineer God through us and through our vision and through our mind into this construct. And it goes both ways, because in some stories and some cultures, the scarecrow represents ultimate evil, especially in modern society and film and things like that. And, you know, the scarecrow also represents good. And just like with this childlike God or this childlike existence that the witch says there's more good in him than all of you humans combined, it seems to me that there is a desire for us through this imagery and through this spirit to recreate our own humanity, or be able to see the potential and the capacity for good or for evil in these images and in these constructs, possibly even to the extent that we're trying to recreate the image of our own God in our image through these constructions. Does that make sense?
It's all pretty wacky, but it does make sense. It's very interesting because sometimes, you know, they don't seem like anything more than just the figures that we make, like the characters that we make. But going back in history and then viewing them in modern culture, you see that a lot. It is all very interesting because, so we talked a little bit with Richard about the Uncanny Valley, and it's almost like the Scarecrows have an opposite effect, or a reversal of the Uncanny Valley. Whereas the Uncanny Valley, we look at a human face or a robotic figure and we start to become disgusted with it or afraid of it because it looks a lot like us, but there's just something there that's not human, that's soulless, so it frightens us away. A scarecrow obviously is not going to look a whole lot human. It's going to have a similar silhouette to us, but it's very obvious that it's not us, and yet we have to give this spirit to it. We have to, we're fond of these things. Whether or not we turn them into the demon from Jeepers Creepers, or whether or not we turn them into Skellington Jack, who sets out with good intentions but screws things up and, you know, has to come back and figure out a way to fix things in the end. It's interesting, our fascination with them, how we really want to put our all into these things. And I think in that context, from Feathertop to Kubiko, it's interesting that we make these gods out of them. We make these idols, essentially, out of them.
Yeah, I think, and what I was trying to say earlier, I think, maybe to simplify it a little bit more, is that we project the capacity or the potential of our own humanity into these things.
We do. Let's also take it to the corn dollies. You know, we talked about, I was making a joke about hay dollies earlier, but corn dollies, they're not really scarecrows, but they are still effigies, and some people think that the word dolly in that etymology is actually coming from the word eidolon or idol.
Right.
But the corn dollies, you know, people would make these
or the
small
corn
figures.
Idols.
The what?
Or the corn idols.
Yeah. So people would make these small handheld figures, or these figures that they would put on tables, basically to appease and worship the corn spirits. And again, it's wanting to make something that we can understand and help along. You're appealing to another spirit that you almost want to be human.
Yeah, again, we're projecting, even beyond our own humanity, projecting our desire of a god or for a god forward into this image and trying to bring that spirit into our own humanity.
And yet, in all of our literature, it kind of gets wonky and messed up, whether it be just a simple trickster that gets in too deep, or a demonic entity that requires sacrifice in order to keep going.
Right, and now it's turned into a smiling, goofy-looking straw man on a stick that we buy at a store and go stick in our front yard for Halloween. You know, and therein, to me, lies the warning. Be careful what you're sticking in your front lawn. Is it a trickster god? Is it, a desire from your own psyche, from your own person, trying to project something into your own life? I don't know. It seems simplistic, but at the same time, it's the way our mind works.
I kind of want to go find Kubiko, see if we can go ask him a bunch of questions.
Yeah, right. In the meantime, I need to go find a very creepy baby doll, paint it up with some clown makeup and stuff it with hay so I can send it to Richard in Ireland so that he can love me all the more for my gift. of that creepy Uncanny Valley doll to him.
A lot of shipping.
It's a lot of shipping. Maybe I'll just take a picture of it. But yeah, we've had a good time talking about Scarecrows. We've got several more topics and other guests to speak with throughout this month. Just as a reminder, go pick up our book, Chaos Subsidiary, The Nightmare Has Begun. 7 short dark fiction stories by the two of us. And by the way, a lot of our silliness and the things that we do here is very different than what's in those stories. So, fair warning.
Yeah, we've actually had people ask if we were okay after reading the book.
Right.
So
please go leave a tip in the tip jar at our Patreon page /The Monster Guys. And thanks to Richard for hanging out with us tonight. If you want to get in on the giveaway, sign up for our newsletter. Again, support us through Patreon or leave a review on iTunes. Join the conversation with us. Send us your Halloween pictures. Tell us about some of your experiences or your favorite memories for Halloween time of year celebrations. We're always on Twitter. You can find us pretty easily there. We look forward to hanging out with you more. There's so much more to come for Halloween in July. We hope you've enjoyed it so far. Yeah, so thanks again for hanging out with us. Enjoy the Monster Guys theme song titled In Search of the Beast, written, performed, and produced by Werewolves in Siberia. Thanks again, everybody. Good night.
good night.